Hey, welcome back. We're still going. Being in Time, Division 2, Chapter 5, Temporality and Historicity. So before we get into this one, I just want to revisit a term which Heidegger used or uses for temporality, which is ecstasis or ecstasy. So he uses that term to describe his analogues of past, present, and future. And I mean, I think I've talked about that enough, but I didn't mention why he chose that, and the reason is it's ancient Greek, and the word ek means out, and stasis means standing. So literally, it means standing outside, and the reason Heidegger chose this, I think, it seems to me, is that if you take the opposite of that, enstasis, which means kind of standing within oneself, so kind of like fully enclosed, we can see then why ecstasis is appropriate for Heidegger in describing these terms, because you can't have one of those tenses without the other two. And it only gets its meaning from the other two. So it's not in stasis. It's not kind of self-sufficient. It doesn't. It's not standing within itself. For example, the future isn't. It's not. It's not. It doesn't get its meaning just from itself alone. It needs the other two in order to exist in the first place. And so ecstasis means that if you have the future exists, and you want the meaning of that, you want to understand it, you have to look outside the future. You have to look at the having been and the making present as well. And so that's why he's using this word, which probably sounds pretty odd if it's the first time you're reading Heidegger, ecstasis. But that's why those three different modes of temporality are called ecstasies. Okay, so anyway, temporality and historicity. What we're looking at here is basically we're changing the focus, because up until now we've been focused on the end of Dasein, death, anticipation. But that's only one end of Dasein. There's another end of Dasein, which is its beginning. So every Dasein has two ends, right? A beginning and death. And so it's the beginning that we want to look at now, and also the period in between, and how that relates to the beginning and the end, because only the being between birth and death presents the whole we're looking for. So there are two things here: being toward the beginning, and the way Dasein stretches along between birth and death. And that's how Heidegger describes it, stretching along between birth and death. And I think the reason he chose such a kind of awkward expression, stretching along between birth and death, is because he wants to avoid this idea of past, present, future, Dasein being in time, and time kind of, a life, human life, kind of moving from the present into the future, or having the future approach, then become present, and then become past. So he wants to avoid any mention of this kind of temporal time movement, and instead chose something that an expression which doesn't have that, doesn't convey a sense of motion like we normally associate with human life. Starting from being a child, then growing up, and an adult, and then into old age, and so on. But that has when we think of that, we think of progression through time. Heidegger doesn't want to have that. His temporality doesn't progress moment by moment. And so a good way to describe it then is to say that Dasein stretches along between birth and death, so that you don't get that idea of progression, moment by moment progression. So of course birth is something that's never, it's never something completed in the past, done and finished. And this is a parallel with death, of course, which is never in the future, something waiting for us. We are always anticipation. We're always being toward death. And in that same way, we're also being toward the beginning. And so Heidegger says that both ends and their between are as long as Dasein factically exists. So that's just kind of what temporality is, right? It's the future, the past, and the present. They all exist. They all co-occur. They all exist together. So this stretching along that Dasein, the stretching along of Dasein, or its betweenness, Heidegger calls occurrence. So he gives it another word. And this is translated in Macquarie and Robinson as historizing. So both of those things mean have the same meaning. And understanding the structure of occurrence, understanding that structure of how Dasein is between birth and death, and the existential and temporal conditions of its possibility, means to gain an ontological understanding of historicity. And historicity, remember, just the way Dasein is between birth and death. Okay, historicity, the occurrence, historizing, that's what we're talking about. The way Dasein stretches out between birth and death, not moving through time. So we have the next section is the vulgar understanding of history and the historizing or the occurrence of Dasein. So first of all, when we talk about history, we usually use it to mean something past. And Heidegger gives us he breaks history down into four component parts. Something that's no longer present, but something that still has an effect on the present. It also means something that's a part of a sequence. So events take place in past, present, future, where events in the past are causally related to events in the future. So kind of putting it on a timeline. That's where the past sits, and it's causally related to the future. It's also a collective understanding of how cultures have changed in time. So the past has that connotation as well. And it also describes what has been handed down. So something that we have received from the past. And so those are the four things that make up what we usually mean when we talk about history, the vulgar understanding of history. And he moves from there to talking about inner worldly beings, inner worldly things, and how they become historical. And to do this, he looks at antiques and asks the question, how are they historical even though they're still here, they're still around? And the answer that he comes up with is that the past is the world within which they were encountered as things at hand, belonging to a context of useful things and used by heedful Dasein existing in the world. That world is no longer, but what was previously inner-worldly in that world is still objectively present. As useful things belonging to that world, what is now still objectively present can nevertheless belong to the past. And so you can see there that what's past about antiques is there's nothing contained within the thing itself, but rather it's referring to the world within which that thing existed at some time, and that world having disappeared, or having it is no longer being around. And that's what makes antiques historical. So it's nothing within the beings, the things themselves. Rather, it's that context. It's that remember, if I use these terms, significance, relevance, the referential context, that context has now gone, and that is what makes that thing historical. So, for example, if you think about, I guess a good example is those old phones with remember the dialing phones you used they had that, I don't even know what they're called, the circular, you had that circular thing, you man, if you're young you won't even know what I'm talking about, so that's how old I am. But yeah, so there were these old telephones, right, and you had to rotate a disc kind of thing, and that was how you dialed. And that is an antique now, not because of something about that phone, but because its referential context is now gone. We don't use those phones anymore. They don't have a place in our world anymore. Their world is now gone. It's a different world, and that's what makes them historical. And so it's a reference to the world, not the thing. That's the bottom line, I think. And because the world, of course, is nothing more than the unity of all of the things in that referential context. That's what significance is, and that's all the world is. And so with that, that's where we get historical. That's where things become historical. Okay, so since world is only for existing Dasein, then the being of historical beings is grounded in the past of that Dasein to whose world that past belonged. And so there's like this is another little chain, I guess, chain of reasoning. Beings they become historical only through a world. But since a world only exists for Dasein, then those historical beings, they get their being from the Dasein whose world they belonged in, if that makes sense. So so you start from what? So you start from the inner-worldly thing, the antique, and that's historical because it belonged to a world which doesn't exist anymore, and that world only exists for a Dasein. And so everything ultimately comes back to Dasein. That's the point, including those antiques. And what makes them historical is Dasein, because Dasein, it's only through Dasein that we get a world, that significance obtains anywhere. Hence, Dasein is what is primarily historical. And I think that's the take-home point here. So beings unlike Dasein, inner-worldly things, are what Heidegger calls world historical. And this means they are historical only by being encountered in the world by a being that is primarily historical, i.e. Dasein. Cool. And since Dasein isn't present like inner-worldly beings, nor can it become historical like them. Okay, so there's that fundamental distinction between inner-worldly beings and Dasein. Since it isn't present like them, it can't become historical like them. And this is because Dasein's very being is care, which is temporality temporalizing itself. That is, a being that is futural and has been in its making present, which is to say, to exist for Dasein is to be historical. And that, again, is just reinforcing that point. Dasein is fundamentally historical, which is, I guess it's similar to, but not quite the same as what we're saying Dasein is temporal. This is where we're focusing on this idea of Dasein's stretching along between birth and death, and how that occurs, how that can happen. And the answer is through occurrence or historizing, which brings us to historicity. And the answer to everything is that Dasein is historical. Okay, let me stop and keep moving. So, the essential constitution of historicity is the next part. And what Heidegger's asking here is, what does it mean to say that Dasein is historical? What is historizing or occurrence? We need to get some kind of a grip on that. We know that Dasein is historical, but what does that mean? So we have those two distinctions again, authentic and inauthentic. So we'll look at the authentic first. Remembering, we're just recapping, resoluteness is self-projection upon one's own being guilty, that is reticent and ready for anxiety. Cool. And it attains its authenticity as anticipatory resoluteness, so being toward death. Nice. But this doesn't tell us what Dasein factically resolves upon. So we have this resoluteness, we're living resolutely, but it doesn't tell us exactly, it doesn't give us any details. It doesn't tell us what to do during life. We know that we are being toward death. We know that we are resolutely projecting ourselves upon our own being guilty, etc., etc. But what do we do? There's no specific kind of guiding information here. It doesn't tell us what Dasein factically resolves upon. And so for this, we have to look at the heritage which that resoluteness takes over as throne. So this is looking back, right? This is that idea. We're looking back now to the beginning. So heritage is the next thing. So what is heritage? Well, basically this is the same. If you've read Sartre, you'll essentially heritage is facticity. And what it is like the facts of our beginning. So there's things like the cultural, familial, and traditional milieu into which we were thrown, and which we have therefore inherited. So that's where we get this idea. That's where Heidegger gets this word heritage from. So it's all those facts about, the place you were born, the parents you were born to, the language you spoke, your how wealthy your family was, the educational opportunities you had, all those kind of things, the culture that you grew up in, they all shape you in certain ways, and they are kind of facts that we can't change about ourselves. And so this is what heritage is. And essentially it creates the boundaries and conditions for our possibilities. So we aren't completely free in the sense that, we have been conditioned in certain ways from our heritage. That's what we got from that. So it conditions our possibilities, our freedom. And because of that, Heidegger calls this our fate. Of course, it's not fate as in like a kind of mystical thing or supernatural or something you're destined to do or to be. It's nothing like that. It's just the word fate, I think, captures that idea that we are something. Our possibilities, our future possibilities, have been conditioned in ways that we didn't have direct control over. We're thrown, right? We know that we don't have complete control over. We don't even have, we're not even the ground of our own existence. We know that we're thrown, and so this is just pulling from that strand, from that thread. So the way that fate operates, and another way to think about this is to say the same thing, is the way Dasein hands down its possibilities to itself, which is an interesting expression, but it says the same thing. The way that fate operates, the way that we get our heritage, the way Dasein hands down its possibilities to itself is through repetition, which we've encountered before, right? And what is repeated in repetition is the possibility of existence that has been handed down. So we get our possibilities handed down to us from ourselves, I guess, our prior selves, and they and we repeat them when we are living in our lives. But this isn't to say that it's a mere copying of what one did before. So we're not bound to those same decisions or those same actions or that same personality or characteristics that we might have. We're not bound to them, in that we don't repeat them literally. Rather, repetition responds to the possibility of existence that has been there. So it's a responding to that heritage. That's what the repetition is. And that's how Heidegger means it to be understood. Not as just continually doing the same things over and over again, kind of fated to repeat the same mistakes that you've always made. It's not that kind of repetition. It's repetition in the sense that we respond to those same events or circumstances or cultural attitudes that make up our heritage. So Dasein doesn't become historical. This is interesting, actually. Dasein doesn't become historical by repetition. So it's not the way that Dasein becomes historical. Rather, it's because Dasein as temporal is historical that it can take itself over in its history. So again, everything's just coming back to this idea that Dasein is historical. And it's that lies at the bottom. So being toward death and heritage produce our anticipatory resoluteness. Being toward death kind of it focuses our existential project and clarifies the way things are for Dasein, what existence is, what it means, how we are to exist. And it sounds like a bad thing, right? It's kind of acknowledging your death, and the fact that we die sounds like a bad thing. But Heidegger says the finitude of existence actually forces us to act, forces us to action, because we know we only have a limited amount of time. So we can't just be lazy. We have to make these kind of videos. We've got to get up and do something, because that's what knowing that our lives are finite creates that impetus. And the way he describes it, he says that the finitude of existence tears one back out of endless multiplicity of closest possibilities offering themselves. Things like just relaxing, doing nothing, sitting on the couch, watching TV, whatever. So there is a kind of silver lining to that. And without it, we wouldn't have that same drive, that same passion to do something, because there's no rush, literally, right? There would be no rush. So that's being toward death, and the other side, heritage, obviously conditions those possibilities, which we just talked about. So those two things kind of feed into our anticipatory resoluteness. Yeah, that's what I just said. So I have a quote which is quite long, but as you know, I like to finish these sections with a quote because Heidegger says it much better than I do. So anyway, the quote goes, only a being that is essentially futural in its being, so that it can let itself be thrown back upon its factical there, free for its death and shattering itself on it. That is, only a being that, as futural, is equiprimordially having been, can hand down to itself its inherited possibility, take over its own thrownness, and be in the moment for its time. Only authentic temporality, that is at the same time finite, makes something like fate, that is authentic historicity, possible. And basically I think that's just summarizes everything I tried to explain in painstaking detail. But this does it nice and cleanly, hopefully. So that's authentic historicity. And now we have a look at the other side, inauthentic historicity. The title, or the heading here, which I've got, is The Historicity of Dasein and World History, and inauthentic historicity in brackets. So Dasein is historical, and the historizing of Dasein is the historizing of the world. Cool. Innerworldly beings are historical through Dasein, we've seen that. So with the existence of historical being in the world, things at hand and present have always already been drawn into the history of the world. Again, that's just that idea, through Dasein. Things can participate in this historizing. Inauthentically entangled in what it takes care of, Dasein reverses this, though, and initially understands its history as world history, calculating its history in terms of what it takes care of. So this is like just being lost, right? It's Dasein being lost in the world again. That's what entanglement is. And so Dasein doesn't realize or fails to grasp that it is temporality and it is historicity, and instead tries to go the other way and get its history through things, through the things themselves, rather than realizing that it's the things get their history from Dasein. And that's basically it. That's basically this section. I will just add a little bit more. Inauthentic historicity, in concealing this stretching along of fate, is blind to its possibilities and incapable of retrieving what has been. So this is an effect of inauthentic historicity. It's lost in the making present of the today, understanding its past in terms of its present. In contrast, the temporality of authentic historicity is a moment that anticipates and retrieves. And one more quote to call it here: if Dasein wants to come to itself, it's quite cool, it's quite a cool quote. If Dasein wants to come to itself, it must first pull itself together from the dispersion and the disconnectedness of what has just happened. So that's a kind of an entangled interpretation of history, that being dispersed and disconnected, in being lost in what is happening now. To understand Dasein's connectedness in the sense of the unity with which experiences are linked together between birth and death is to experience one's authentic historicity. And that is chapter 5. And that means we have only one more left. Congratulations if you've made it this far. Congratulations to me for making it this far. Anyway, we've got one more left. And if all goes well, I'll punch that out shortly. Until then, again, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.